All right. Hopefully this will be uh, audible online. I think so. Seeing the activity. Thanks everybody for joining in physically and online. I don't think we're going to have too much of a interference from outside, so that's okay. We have directed mics. Okay, I'm Bukosi. I am the director of the African Institute for Data Science and AI based here at the university. And this is one of our seminars, hybrid. So we have people joining us online as well as physically here in the room. So you will see there's just the camera there, so for people just in case, so that the interactions later on. Today, we're very happy to have Dr. Kimon, who's joining us and will be giving this talk while we set up everything in the background. Kimon is a social scientist studying the social and political implications of data-driven technologies, with a particular focus on AI ethics, public perceptions of algorithms, and the societal impacts of automated decision-making. What we typically do is we give about 35 to 40 minutes of a talk, and then after that, we can then go into Q&A. So thank you. I'll leave it up to you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Bukosi, for having me in this series. I'm pretty excited to be here. Yeah, so let's see. Let's start. Okay, yeah, I just have a thought about me slide. So I'm currently at the Kutler Center. I will join the University of Amsterdam in the beginning of September, so that's basically part of my farewell tour again. And I was before also in Amsterdam at a project which was called Anticipating Impacts in a Diverse Society. And most of my talk will rely on stuff that I did there. So it's like I try to summarize what I did in my 3 years of postdoc in one presentation. So so I hope that all makes sense in the end. So I worked before in Amsterdam at the University of Amsterdam, the collaboration project with the US, with Northwestern University. So that's why also some of the empirical studies that I will show today that we conducted is in collaboration with the EU sample and with the US sample. As Bukosi said, I'm a social scientist, communication science by training, but I define myself more broader in the social science because we do just everything, right? And I am a committee member of ACM Fact and AIS. I don't know if you know these conferences. I think that's where my standing is in the computer science more. And I'm also a member of this Evaluations Coalition, which, funnily enough, where Bukosi and I virtually met the first time. And currently, again, I'm here as a postdoctoral fellow at this African German Center for Data Science and Sustainable Food Systems. So my talk basically is today about how do we actually bring social science knowledge into like the data science or computer science or AI work in evaluations. And I will just try to share some perspectives I have for that as a social scientist. And that's also I will showcase some studies that we did with computer scientists also together to actually show how we can bring expertise in. And also let's a call to participation, call to action. I'm always happy to start new collaborations, especially also with scholars now from South Africa, where I'm now currently at. So I'm very eager to also hear your input and how to see how we can actually work together, because I think AI brings a chance that we can actually do something really great when researchers come together. And I start this presentation with a quote from a research group which I also met at this evaluations conference, where Bukosi and I connected with. And this was a paper led by a Microsoft team, and they basically said evaluating generative AI systems is a social science measurement challenge, which was directly okay, now here I feel comfortable. So what they actually say in this paper is they argue quite it's a short paper, 4 pages, I recommend also reading it. It's basically saying where do social science come into all the stuff that computer scientists are doing in the evaluation space. And they really start quite generic and basically saying, okay, we do have measurement problems, which are about complex concepts that actually need conceptualization and theoretization. And then they outline in this paper what we actually can learn. So they argue that the systematization that you do in social science, normally when you encounter like a specific problem, helps in understanding and formulating what exactly is measured. So the systematization process, like when we start about thinking about a problem, and they in their paper they argue normally with like stereotyping language as a classical challenge for like computer science. That is something where we actually need a lot of input, and we have a lot of different concepts that we actually need to grasp. So they say also here in this paper that systematization enhances participation, transparency, deliberation, ultimately expertise. So they say, for example, a stereotyping language, it's very important here also to already bring together here like different experts from different also sciences, but also like stakeholder groups. For example, when we talk about stereotyping language, which stereotype do we want to measure? Like we have so many vulnerable groups. We have like specific regions of the on the earth that are not normally included. We have like people like LGBTQ people who are not normally included in evaluation challenges. So again, when you ask different stakeholder groups, they probably have a different understanding of actually what a stereotyping language is. So other things that needs to be included in like a measurement concept. But we also have like measurement concepts that are different in different disciplines. So in psychology, that would be, for example, a different thing than maybe in more the language-based sciences. So again, systematization helps in bringing it all together. And then also when we look at measurement theory, that basically means in the social science directly, how do we translate and measure like a specific concept? There we have in the social science a long tradition of like how to actually, for example, develop scales, right? And you need to develop a scale, you need to validate that, you have like a conceptual and theoretical background, which we rely on. And this is an interesting concept to bring in to computer science, because that's what they outline also in the paper is in computer science, sometimes, obviously not always, we have like a background concept, we define this concept, and then we just bring it to annotators in like many of the established evaluation frameworks that we have, and then the annotators are basically left alone a little bit, and then like, okay, now we measure something, and then we have like these cool annotating tool to measure stuff. Again, here social science can bring in some of the some of the blind spots, and make just like it makes it conceptually more rich. So this is just how I normally also think about when I'm talking about with other research about social science, like how do we bring it in? But more concretely to what I was doing, or like I'm doing like for like 3 years now, is I really looked into evaluation in terms of risk, like risks that of AI. And we started one paper with this quote of Bernstein, who said like risk is a choice, not a fate. So we were interested in our research, like how do we actually measure and mitigate risks of AI system? And that's also, I conceive, like part of like an evaluation, how to make actually AI safe, inclusive, and whatnot. And there again, social science, we relied on theory. Here we go to Gellert, who is more in the legal and regulatory space, who defines risk as an anticipative decision-making tool, where risk is an event of a certain magnitude or severity that has a number of chances of occurrence and which carries along with it a number of consequences, both negative and positive, which are themselves of a certain magnitude and have a probability on their own. Complicated. What it actually means is, let's say there are two phases in risk management of technologies. And we have a risk assessment. That means we need to first of all define like what is actually a risk factor. So what can actually be something that occurs when we're deploying AI. That has like a specific condition or hazard that they determine how probably is that this risk materializes. When we talk about hate speech, then the risk factor is like, okay, we have like language that might be harmful. Then the question is like, under which conditions does this risk actually occur? Which severity has this risk? So there are different, we can argue that there are different levels of like how severe is the hate speech that we find. And an assessment of the actual impact that, for example, means like if a specific person is harmed, like an individual is harmed by this hate speech, what follows of it. And when we have this risk assessment phase, Then normally comes the risk management, where we have like decision makers, normally political decision makers, regulators. But for example, when we talk about designing AI systems, it can also be just developers of AI system that then need to make actually a decision on like how much risk is acceptable, how much risk is maybe too much. So there's like a risk cost benefit analysis to determine that. And then also we define mitigation measures, basically saying like, okay, for like when we are developer of computer science tools, we basically say like, what can we do technically maybe to counteract like harmful speech. But on the policy level, that can be, okay, what policy measures we actually need to enact to counter this harm. And what we then did in a theoretical paper that we wrote with my co-authors, Natalie Hellberger and Nick Diakopoulos, we looked at general and global space, but also with a focus in the EU, on risk regulation. And we find that also in South Africa, we find that basically globally as an answer to how do we manage harms of AI system is basically saying, okay, we make a risk-based approach. And a risk-based approach is always to say like we need to anticipate specific risks to govern and challenge the opportunities of AI. And what they normally say and what you normally find in like these very polished policy guidelines, and you find that in the EU, but you also find that in the now retracted AI policy framework in South Africa, basically saying we need to balance the need to protect important societal values like fundamental rights or health and safety, but then at the same time be transparent and leave ample room for innovation. And that's like already like the risk management trade-off that we're seeing here, right? And our paper and our thoughts about the soul, or how I think generally about like the harms, is always to say like, okay, that's great, but what does it actually mean? So the success and the legitimacy of these approaches actually depends then critically on looking what measures are there and how well equipped are they actually to tackle like these challenges that AI systems pose to society. And we have that on a regulatory space. In the EU, you have the UAI Act. I don't know if you know about that. So that's a framework where you basically say like companies now need to adhere and fulfill specific standards. We don't have that in South Africa yet. Takutswa, who is sitting there in the audience, and we were just thinking a little bit of what can be done in South African space to do that. Yeah, in the US, obviously under Trump, they don't have any of that. So they have like some voluntary risk management frameworks, but yeah, it's a bit bleak. So we thought of, okay, how do we critique that what's going on? How can we assess that? And I skipped to the next. Yeah, I'll start with that. So we thought in general, and that's where later on where our empirical study set in, to think about scenarios. Like when we talk about AI, we talk about risks, we always ask ourselves, okay, what is actually the space that needs to be governed? Like what are the risks that actually need to be managed? That is an excerpt of a report from a German foundation who was like working with like one of the specific regulatory requirements and try to map how actually risk auditing processes are done. And they say, okay, first of all, we need to decide on the platform and systemic risks. And then we need to have a plan, which makes we need to identify the stakeholders and map out the audit process. We need to define scenarios. We need to measure the risk, again, social science challenge. And then we need to evaluate like how much risk do we actually have to make an audit report. That means in practice, we, for example, have like these statements. So an individual, group, institution defined by some kind of characteristic has experienced a harm that's related to something happening on the platform. And this is also has a macro impact. That is very, very macro. What that means, as an example, what they bring in their report is a young adult who is temporarily in a personal crisis, is overly exposed to a video describing or showing self-harm by the recommender system for the For You feed, and this might exacerbate the general mental health crisis of young adults. That's an example. But we can easily think of many, many, many more examples and scenarios that actually platforms now need to deal with. And again, here you can see, and that is something that we will talk about later, that it's very, very contextual, right? And it's very conditional. And it's very much dependent on who is formulating these statements, what is actually measured in the end. So when we actually look at what the regulatory space and what practical like impact and risk assessments are doing right now, we see a lot of shortcomings in that. And that is, I think, also like a statement that is globally, again, like we look mostly on the use space, but this is also in general, when you think about risk and impact assessment that are dominated by also reports from like the big tech companies and so on. So we do see a problem in inclusion, and that is, I think, that is most important also for the South African space. Is we normal risk assessments don't really require public input, like don't require like the views of affected communities. And again, if you are like a computer scientist or like if you're working for a big tech company and you need to come up with, okay, which risks actually my system is posing, he probably has a different worldview than someone who is like affected on the other on the receiving end of an AI system. And we can talk about that, for example, with mass surveillance technology. We can talk about this with like technology that is used in public institutions. So it is always different if I'm programming something, I have a specific tech background, and then if you are on the receiving end of it all. And then of inclusion, we obviously also talk about that is definitely global north dominated and not global south dominated. So the values of countries like South Africa are normally not really included in like these general impact assessment framework, but still platforms like Meta, X, and so on, they are operating here, but they are targeted, they are carrying their own risk framework with. And that obviously creates friction. And that is something that we think needs to be addressed. So that also means we have an expert bias that I also talked about already, that we have like some companies that normally like doing these assessments and some specific disciplines that doing this these assessment, and like social science, for example, are not really represented normally. And then also, when we come to management, we have a limited guidance for like making trade-off decisions. Like who is like, even if like we have like a computer scientist, or like someone who's the assessor, who's like very well minded, wants to do like a concrete assessment, like who's actually telling this person like what is an acceptable risk or not? What is included there in the risk management process? And that is again something that can cause friction. And when we see that is from this evaluation coalition, they published a report, and I don't want to go into detail here, but this is like first-party audits and this is third-party audits. And basically, the brighter the colors, the more concrete the assessment was of these different categories. And what you can see here, that third-party audits are way more thorough than first-party audits, which makes sense because if you're a first-party auditor and you regulate and audit your own system, you probably don't want to find too many risks. But if you look at the third-party auditors that are like external, like NGOs, they say like, okay, there's actually a lot more going on. So that's a problem. That's a friction that we can look at. Try to jump to the next one. So what we also saw, what is commonly not really included in risk assessment frameworks is we have a fixation of actually existing risk, but when, for example, when you think back when generative AI or like these ChatGPT and these models were introduced, we didn't have actually much knowledge what could all happen with these systems. And we could also argue, okay, but maybe it can be like an obligation for people who want to introduce this systems that they actually also look at what might be just harms that might be occurring in the future that you might not know yet. And that is something where we think, when we, for example, think of these chatbots and these reports where vulnerable groups chatted with chatbots and then committed suicide, obviously you can always not pin it down like this was the AI, that was the system. But also that was an amplifier, maybe. Like, could that be something that can be foreseen? And maybe just thinking about this in the assessment process of risk management, that could be something very valuable. And the last thing I just want to highlight here is what we also see normally in frameworks, we have a focus on compliance. So basically, you have a checklist and say like, okay, my system is this and is so good and so on, and a focus on quantification. But with quantification, like putting something in numbers, and again, social science measurement challenge, social science versus computer science sometimes. We do reduce complexity and contextuality and lose actually like some of the narratives and some of the stories that might actually emphasize what a risk is about. And for example, when you think about human rights violations, how do you actually count something like that? How do you weigh something like that? So these are all micro like decisions that we think needs to be addressed more thorough in frameworks. And I'm not the one who's telling, okay, how can we do that all? But we are just saying there are just things that are underrepresented right now, and that could be very interesting to look at. So going from this very, very theoretical part now to what I did in the last 3 years in my postdoc research. I developed with my colleagues a way of a social science method to anticipate impacts. And we called that scenario-based socio-technical envisioning. I will show you examples of that later. What we did here is we looked at the literature, and there's a lot of literature from sometimes business studies, but also from technology and society studies and future studies that is about scenarios and scenarios as a measurement tool. And that basically means we simulate or we write plausible future simulations of what can happen if a technology unfolds. So that means we don't have one specific future state, but we do have a lot of different future states that can happen if a technology develops. And it's basically about mapping these different futures to see what is plausible to happen. And then also with that, saying what can be done to achieve a specific future that would be like an normative scenario. How can a specific target reach? So how, for example, can we build a more equitable society? How can we build fairer AI systems? This is the idea. And using scenarios and future anticipations is an empirical tool. How can we achieve that? And again, we say it's never neutral. I'm not saying it's I can do a neutral way of mitigating and assessing risks. No, it's always a subjective thing. And we always, and that is now with the next slide, we always rely on participatory approaches. So the idea here that I'm following in my research is that I'm saying I cannot model a specific future state, but I want to ask specific stakeholder groups and how do they perceive the future to develop in consideration of a specific technology. And for us, that's normally generative AI. And that is then the literature on participatory foresight we're normally looking at. And then I also don't want to go in the nitty gritty here. There are different levels of participation. So how much do you actually involve participants in your studies? And we are normally trying to include them, collaborate with people, but it depends on your research project. I mean, there are lots of, I think in the US, we and AI and the resist list, there's lots of stuff where actually it is also about ownership. For our studies, we look more into how can we actually include and highlight voices that are commonly not really represented in risk assessments. And then we coined that scenario-based socio-technical envisioning. What we are doing is basically just using scenarios for future anticipations of AI impacts. I still have 15 minutes roundabout. Okay, perfect. So I will show you some of the empirical studies that we did. I will focus here on the journalism and media environment because we have a pipeline of studies that we published that follows a specific narrative, and that's also in collaboration with computer scientists. So that's the easiest and also the best fitted for this talk to talk about. But we also did studies on personal chatbots. We did studies with the scenario writing on academic knowledge production, on legal conflicts. We during a study now for political deepfake. So there's a lot of applications possible with that. First study I want to present here is the initial study for scenario writing was about anticipating impacts in the media environment, and then from Gen AI that was published in AI and Ethics. What we did in this study, and that also follows all now the theoretical background I talked about. So here we gathered 119 scenarios, and then from 3 different stakeholder groups. So we asked news consumers, content creators, and technology developers to talk about or to imagine like how generative AI will impact the future of news production in 5 years from now. We asked EU citizens, so we have a broader sample on the EU because we are working in with the legal background there. And then we made an open coding, like a qualitative measurement strategy to actually map the impacts. And this is the core of what we are doing in the scenario study. So we are really having a survey. We also tested that in workshops. And that's also a tool that you can do in workshops. I gave a few with, for example, journalists, but also media practitioners to test that. But for this study, we made a writing task in Prolific, like one of the survey companies. And then we asked people, write 300 words or more or less about how Gen AI could create risk or negative impact for the news environment in 5 years from now. And then we really let people be completely free in choosing like which is the character you want to focus on, or what impacts you will describe. So we are really interested in like the creativity of people. And the only thing that we said here, please write that informed by your own conviction. So you don't write science fiction. Please try to really think through what can happen plausibly in 5 years. And then we go from there and develop like a risk assessment framework. And that is what participants came up with. These are just 2 examples from the stories that we received. So the first one is, I think that was actually a journalistic news writer who talked then about Hans. The story take part in the Netherlands, and Hans is a photographer, and now he's competing with generative AI because like now you can make up pictures and create pictures. So the initial thing is that we see here Hans is in competition, and then he uses generative AI, but it backfires. So like he hallucinates like a specific image in the scenario, and then he essentially spreads fake news, and then Hans, our main character, he gets fired, and there's actually legal action filed against it. I think quite plausible scenario that the participants described there. Then the next scenario then was about Robert. Also, Robert is also a journalist working, and then the scenario actually quite well describes like how basically human knowledge and the human touch or whatever you call it is actually fading away in news organizations who are like trying to now use Gen AI more and more and more. And then so in this scenario is then described that basically the audience is losing like the critical engagement with news. So the Robert, our protagonist, calls himself in the end an AI janitor, like basically only looking what AI comes up with and then just basically clicking yes and no, like should we publish that or not. But like the really journalistic work is a bit diminished. And that is just examples like, and again, like it's not about like, is that 100% plausible, but it's like what people think about and how it can develop in the future. So what we did, like 120 scenarios, we all analyzed them. That took a little bit of time to go through all the scenarios. And then we came up, and I won't go through all of that here in the paper. We found 50 specific impacts in like clustered in 10 impact themes, so a lot of material that we actually go through, and then basically come up with like an AI report on risk of AI in the news environment that is based on like these example quotes that I just showed you. And then here are the quotes. I won't go into detail here what we all saw. And the interesting thing that what we did afterwards, and that is also where you can use scenarios when you are actually dealing with like a assessment problem, is you can take the scenarios as a base and then ask people afterwards, like, okay, now you have the scenario, what can be actually done to mitigate the harms that were described? you can ask the participants to reflect on their own scenario. That's what we did here. But what I also did is I gave a workshop in Norway where I just came with like one of these scenarios there, and I just gave the scenario to a specific group of that was mixed with like scholars and with media practitioners, and asked them like, and now you brainstorm about what can be done. And that was actually quite effective and like really making people think of like how can we improve like news systems and news environments in that are threatened by Gen AI. Here we ask participants to reflect on their own scenario, and then also again they come up with a lot of different things how it can be done. So we have like the regulation. So here the quote would be to regulate the use of AI in certain fields. Here the other participant said we need public education, we need a stronger oversight. So there's again a lot of stuff that can be get from the scenarios. And again, we coded all of that and provided quotes. Okay, so that's the first study. I won't go over that one now. That's the first study that we did here. And then that actually sparked interest in Nick Diakopoulos, who was from Northwestern University, who is a computer science. So that sparked the interest of one of his PhD students called Julia Barnett. And she led 2 different papers that I will also present now, which is more based from a computer science angle, actually. How do we can use scenarios more in a computer science environment? And that one was published at AAS conference in 2024. And what Julia did here, and this is like the nice framework that she developed, she was interested in the question, can we actually also like simulate scenarios? How well does it work to simulate scenarios? And can we use the scenarios to test specific policies? So test specific mitigation strategies. So what we did here is Julia started with like all our specific impact codes, and she generated like 150 scenarios, so like 3 per impact type. And then in the first step, we actually looked at it and see like, okay, is Gen AI actually able to generate a scenario that we think is valid for the case? Then we already saw, okay, 11 of the impact types we needed to retract because like we thought the Gen AI model was not really able, and it was 2024, it's a little bit back, but the Gen AI model was not really able to create a scenario which we think was actually describing the harms quite well. For example, some of the things also make sense because we have categories like spreading fake news or something like that, right? So then obviously, if you task Gen AI directly to create fake news, the OpenAI model says like, no, I'm not doing that. I'm writing about something else. Or like, for example, we also had something like stereotypical language, right? Or write something about that because that came up as a harm. So Gen AI didn't do that. So we ended up with 33 scenarios. And then what we did in another task is then we asked ChatGPT, or we tasked ChatGPT to rewrite the scenarios and say if a specific transparency regulation, and we took the description there from the UAI Act, is enacted, how would that change the scenario and rewrite that? So we did that, we simulate the scenarios, and then we gave it back, and that's where the participatory element of our studies comes in. So we always want to feed it back to actually affected people. So we did a public opinion survey and then asked actually participants, do you think this is actually made sense and the transparency obligation helped? So that was the prompt that we provided here. And so here you can see on the one side, this is the initial scenario, and then this is the scenario that came up when we let ChatGPT rewrite the scenario. And just to go quickly over the results here is that we could see like, okay, the first, that's the interesting one to look at. This is like the severity of risk, can it be mitigated? And we see it's especially helpful in mitigating harm such as labor and well-being. Like makes sense, like with well-being, okay, if I know is this an I, then I might not be misled, and I can be maybe more thorough with the interaction with AI. Okay. Then the last study I just want to quickly go over in the last 5 minutes that I have is we published that at FACT 25 also with Julia, another paper that was directly based on what we did here. And here we were interested in actually activating lay stakeholders, like basically citizens. That also goes back to the critique I had before, right? That we don't have these voices in identifying mitigation approaches. And really also then tap into the creativity and like really map out the space of different policies that can be enacted in terms of reducing harms. And we took, again, 10 of the harms that Julia simulated in our first study. So it was directly based on the study scenarios that we had here. So we presented our participants with like 10 different scenarios and then asked, please formulate so-called stakeholder action pair. So like say which stakeholder should do what in order to mitigate the harm. And then we did in the second step, a second survey where we asked to do like a value ranking, like where we asked basically participants which stakeholder, which SAPs should be addressed first. And then we did also create some fact sheets with a GPT model. So how does it look like? We asked literally the participants who should do what. And then they came up like, again, I won't go into the detail here, with like a massive matrix of like, there's so much complexity in it when we think about what can be done to mitigate harms. But what stand out is that we had the top stakeholders were like governments, tech companies, and news publishers were the ones who like were most likely to be addressed in like who actually needs to take action. So it was not like citizens need to do what? No, it was mostly, okay, tech companies need to do something. And top actions here that we found over the scenarios were like fact checking, improved digital literacy, transparency that came up. And then when we had the space, we asked literally like news publishers should ban AI to write news stories. For example, was a statement. And then we asked people to rate these statements. And again, here you find, okay, obviously, most participants say like most of these stakeholder action pairs should be enacted. That's always an easy thing to say. But for example, we had the US sample here. They didn't want to have bans or limits, which quite well fits with the US context. Yeah. And we had like some other interesting trends emerge, like who should do what. And in the third study that I don't have time to go on here, like that we published that year, in fact, is actually Julia really managed to create like a policy simulator actually. So we actually had also like expert costs factored in, public costs factored in, where we actually brought in like the how much would it cost to enact like a specific policy and then try to narrow down on what can actually be done. Okay, so that was a lot of input. Just to conclude here is I think that is all inspired like by social science and was, as you can see here, like a collaboration with computer scientists. So social science perspective and measurements, I think, are inherently important when we evaluate AI systems because they do bring specific knowledge, perspective, and measurement knowledge also with. And I can see that often when I'm reviewing for a fact of IAS, that the measurement is mostly under complex. And these are the papers I normally then reject because I think like you didn't really think through the problem. Like how do you actually draw up your measurement? How do you draw up with your evaluation system? And I think it's inherently important to read and to collaborate there with people who are trained to do that. And I mean, I'm not trained to do like simulations. That's what I have Julia for, thankfully. So she's normally doing building these models. But we are working together and informing each other with our background. And that is, I think, very, very important. And also here, I want to say, like, don't undervalue like qualitative methods because the scenarios that we generate, I think, are a very good starting point to actually go into deliberation practices. And in the end, maybe you develop a quantitative measurement, but the first step is like really thinking through a problem that actually that's where actually qualitative measures come in. And the last point I just want to make here is that also, I mean, it wasn't that much here present in the talk, but I think global South views and values are currently largely underrepresented. Like also our studies, obviously, I was in the Netherlands working with the US, where focused there. But we do have a lot of different perspectives on the continent in South Africa, like with languages, what Mukosi is doing, obviously, right? So where we actually need to activate that. And I hope that the methods that I brought here are transferable, but obviously we need to do more studies here to actually bring that knowledge in. And I think I close with that. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Kimon. Well, I guess people just prepare some questions.
Yes.
I guess on one is thinking about practicality.
Yes.
Some parts is simulation, but then in this case, if you think about some of the use cases you talked about, how do we get this actually into a process on the ground, given time? This is a very fast-moving space, and now it's almost every couple of hours we're waiting to be shocked by something else. So how do we deal with that? And then maybe as you're thinking about answering that question, if you do have a question, you can just raise your hand. We'll acknowledge you, and then we'll bring up the puck. And then if you're online, just raise your hand as well. We'll acknowledge you then, and then we'll just ask you to unmute.
Yeah. Perfect. I mean that. You're right. Obviously, we always we need to evaluate fast and do stuff. I think it depends also in which field you are talking about and where you are looking at. For example, the media environment that we were looking at now. When we think about media companies right now are quite they are trying to figure out a way, but obviously their credibility also hangs on we need to do that carefully in implementing Gen AI systems in the workflow. So what the AI Media Democracy Lab, just making some advertisement here, is doing, I have a lot of colleagues in Amsterdam who are actually working together with media companies, and they are thinking about how can we do that. And the Danish BBC is working with them, Dutch one. So it's really, they are interested in that question, and they have a little bit more time to actually think about that. And we pitched scenarios to them, so they are also quite keen and interested in making an exercise like that in their own companies, where they actually think, okay, how can we do that? So that is something. And then another thing which you can say, obviously, if you have a regulatory framework that say you need to do that, then people need to do that. So again, governments can enact specific policies, and obviously not say you need to do this specific our scenario method to do that. But you could, for example, say you are mandated to do a more qualitative report first, right? And then in EU, you need to do that. Otherwise, now you are, if you have high-risk system at least, right? But so there are, I think, things where you can do a little bit of that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So yes, so you can do the puck, Capello. Just I guess introduce yourself, just who you are, where you're from, and then.
Yeah, thanks so much, Doc, for that. My name is Yanga Malotana. Academically, I'm in the space of sustainability and transitions. But work-wise, I'm in the space of agent-based modeling and digital twin technology as it relates to systems. So thank you so much for your presentation. I only have two questions. The first is on the measurement gap and the role that anticipatory governance plays in that. You had the structural critiques, all 7 of them, but the key ones that stood out for me was the exclusion of the unknowns, the unknown unknowns, and also the focusing on the risks. And I know that in the sustainability space, we face the challenge of the transitions that we have, the paradoxes where mitigating one risk generates another downstream. And I'm curious on whether or not you think the measurement theory approach can handle these emergent kind of second order friction scenarios that you can't anticipate, rather than just risks that have kind of been made legible.
Yeah.
And then the second point I had was on participation and power. I know you said you don't want to get into the nitty-gritties of the 4 levels, but please indulge me a little bit with this. I know that there's a risk in participation where it can be co-opted as legitimization without actually shifting power.
Yes.
And I'm just curious, in the work that you have done, what safeguards distinguish genuine ownership from depoliticized box ticking, for example, particularly when stakeholders have somewhat of an asymmetric capacity in the way that they engage in the participation, and how do you prevent the anticipation process itself from being better captured by better resourced actors?
Yeah.
That makes sense. It's about it from my side. Thanks.
Yes. Okay.
No, that's it. Yeah. Oh, you can hold it if you want.
Yeah. The great questions, and great questions are always ones that are difficult to answer, but I try. So I start with the second one. I mean, that is something we did think a lot about. Like the studies that are presented now are more like I think more in the inclusion space. So it's not like we evolve participants so much because we have like a given task. We let them creatively write something, but in the end, we are interested in like their input. I mean, there you can say in social science, we do pay participants for taking part. So I feel like this is something where we can do something, but obviously there we don't have like a co-ownership or something, but it's like it was set up as like a paid task. And then you can obviously you have then the whole discussion like how much should you pay participants? We try to inherit like standards, but there's nothing more that we did there. But I think there's a lot of space, especially with these methodologies, to actually work on a long-term projects together with partners. And that is something here again, like with the AI Media Democracy Lab, like if you have like space capacities, if you have like a network, also like you have a big network, right? So you can actually partner up and team up with like interested organizations and, for example, one specific stakeholder group. So what I did, and unfortunately my job in Amsterdam ran out at the time where we could finalize it, but my colleague Laurens Nautz, he's a Belgian researcher and lawyer, also teamed up with us, and we had some initial and very good conversation with the LGBTQ network in Amsterdam. There's the Amsterdam Law Hub, and they were interested in that. And we had like some initial conversations, and then it's really you need to like dedicate a lot of time to that. You need to build up a trust relationship with these groups, and then obviously you need to do research then together, where you actually invite them also to come in and say like, what are the things that you are interested in? Because we had an initial conversation and I was like, okay, the scenarios on media environment, that's maybe a little bit too broad for us. We want to focus directly on like misinformation, right? And that is then something where you can say like, okay, we develop like the instrument then together. And this is then really about like teaming up with like specific interest groups and NGOs that are interested in that. And what I also talked about with like the other media organizations. So it is a lot of networking that you need to do. And I think when you have this network and when you have people who will also then normatively align on something, then you can build up a research project which go more into the ownership level. I hope that answers it. And for the first one, that was like, how do you anticipate like the trickle down? Yeah, I mean, in our scenarios, we ask participants to anticipate 5 years into the future, right? And sometimes when we read the scenarios, that was then, and that's the cool thing with an evolving story, right? Then participants from themselves actually describe that, because then they said like, okay, this thing happened, and then that caused another impact or another harm, right? So we do have like something of that, but I think there are other measures in the future science that are probably more apt to answer that. I don't know if you know the future wheel. Yes. So I think I would then say like the scenarios maybe not the best, but then combining it with like the future wheel or something. I think that's very promising to do. Yeah.
Sorry, the puck is just so that people online can hear perfectly.
Well, thanks. I'm Bazama Josie. I'm in the student success space, and much of my work is on the development of educational technologies. So I've got two questions. One is a disciplinary one. So much of the work that you're sharing is mostly on anticipation, and I found that to be under science diplomacy. So I just want to ask, how much do you position it like that for different stakeholders to actually think about how to engage, but maybe under the science diplomacy area, which I've seen a lot of the countries are actually pushing that. And the second one is, in terms of the risk, I think you've heard about vibe coding, where the developers will be using natural language to actually code and make the systems. And it has so much critique and so on, and also risk. So on the practical side, I just want to ask, how can we be thinking about looking at future risk in the use of Gen AI, in particular for developing of the systems? And how can we think about this? Like you were talking about the simulations. Just on a practical note, how can we think about that? Because much of that hasn't been tested at the moment, while at the same time, vibe coding is actually growing. Everyone is developing apps and the systems.
Just before we get after this, or I don't want to yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm Machtel Mathieu from the Department of Informatics. And I was just thinking, the stakeholders you involve are not necessarily technical experts. So I was just wondering, to what extent can they give viable scenarios if they do not understand in full the capabilities of the technology? Have you thought about that?
I take that, right?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Okay, yeah, I think I start with the second one if that's okay, because yeah, we thought about that. That's also like a common review or critique that we are having. And yes, I think not all of the stuff that we read in the scenarios is like where we think like, okay, that's super realistic. But there is like also like depends on the technology again. Like people have a lot of agency how they actually think of interacting with the system. And we had a different study, for example, on chatbots, right? And I think chatbots are very consumer-oriented technology. So again, like when just normal consumers interact with the chatbot, they might influence the way it actually responds and develops, right? So I would say here that the imaginaries can be quite broad, because when we look 5 years in the future, like I don't know, like maybe some of the things are possible, especially when people have an input on how like the technology evolves, right? But yeah, I think in general it is about highlighting what people think about this, and then we as researchers, obviously we can then feed that back to like experts, and like just as a common ground for discussion and brainstorming, and saying like, do you think that's possible? What is interesting, like even if it's not possible or plausible, both, then the communication scientist and me said like, it's still interesting, the result, because that tells you something what the hype narrative in what we experience in the world is actually about, right? So I mean, we had different studies on legal conflict resolution, which was super interesting, and then people talked a lot about like automated AI judges, right? And then it was like about, okay, we have the robot judge in the end. We, from the European angle, especially, see like, okay, that would probably not happen. But this is what is actually activated in people's minds, what can happen. And then we have a discussion where we think like, okay, maybe the narrative, the public narrative needs to shift a little bit. So again, not everything is plausible. And I think there we need to then go in workshops, for example, and validate the stuff that we are finding with like specialists from the computer science. I hope that answers it. Okay, to your questions. Okay, sorry. Can you repeat? Give me the keywords.
Sorry, was on looking at your work in the lens of science diplomacy.
The science, yeah.
And the second one was on the risk, and how do we look at future risk in terms of vibe coding when you're using natural language to develop systems?
Yeah, I mean the vibe coding one. I think there are lots of risks. Personally, I don't know. I don't know. We need to make a study on that to actually assess the risk. What I can say for our own approach to doing research, and then also like working together with computer scientists this year, because we simulated also a lot of scenarios, what we always think is essential is like we always had like the feeding backstage in, right, where we actually took the scenarios and then asked participants, like in the end, like, is that a plausible thing? Is it a respondent thing? So like getting human in the loop, and sometimes it's us as a research team, and sometimes it's also like just the public input, and then go through the stage, and then we can actually see like how to prevent like vibe coding. I'm not a fan of qualitative analysis with AI. I think that's something you also mentioned. I think we lose a lot in doing that because part of the qualitative research process is to actually understand the material, to read the material. So we lose a lot of insights in which are saying like, okay, we know we wipe code the whole coding procedure. So I think maybe it can assist at some point when we have a coding scheme. I personally would not like to be replaced by wipe coding there. I hope that answers that. And the diplomacy question, I don't have a good answer to that, unfortunately, right now. So yeah, maybe we need to talk later about that. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. There's just one question. Okay, two questions that come online. But just for context, also we have Angel, who's just double check here. I'm not wrong. Okay, yeah. Angel, who has a question, but then also Manala, I think, who's also engaging with the eval work, and I think also is working on some work with some collaborators in Singapore and UNU in Macau on looking at evaluation. So I think there's a couple of people who are probably going to reach out after in this space. But from Angel, who's a postdoc also, who's spending part of her time with us, she's a plant pathologist, and out of interest, you worked on different domains throughout your academic journey. Did you find the friction in agricultural AI different from journalism domains? Does the materiality of farming, weather, biology change what public interest means compared to more purely informational domains? And the last one, do public perceptions of algorithms, trust, fairness, intuitions actually feed back into your anticipatory governance recommendation? Right, yeah. And then is perception treated as data or something that is managed or shifted? That's going to be our last question.
Okay.
Yeah. And then...
Cool. Okay, yeah, for the first one, unfortunately, I didn't have the possibility yet to look into to do a scenario writing on the agricultural space, but I think what I can say is I wanted to do that. I searched for collaborators here. It was quite difficult to find them in the first place. But then what happens when I thought through the process is I do have it's more challenging for me because the systems that we are looking at in the agricultural space are not really consumer facing. And what I realized and what the most thing that I was doing here in my previous research was mostly focused on we have something that actually consumers are in some way interacting with, and that's it easier to anticipate. And I think I had some concepts of doing some empirical research here. Unfortunately, that didn't wasn't really put into practice. But I think it's tougher to formulate that if you have something with remote sensing or some things where you actually have the harms that are, I think, quite on a high level. So what I think actually that was that also learning process that I had, that I actually think that most of the things that we were actually interested in our research are what the EU defines high risk systems or unacceptable risk systems, because these are the systems where you actually can see a lot of friction, where you probably need a lot of more governance than is actually existing right now. And the last question was, sorry, again.
It's how do public perceptions actually feed back into anticipatory governance? And is perception treated as data or something that can be managed or shifted?
I mean, public perception to be shifted is something that I don't want to do as a researcher, because that means also manipulating a little bit what people think about. So I think, but what is interesting in really highlighting what the public thinks about things and then informing political decision makers that these are things that people think about. And for example, we did write, or my colleagues also write some recommendations for the UAI Commission, right? And basically saying these are public perception study that we did. That is something that we found was audience are thinking about AI, what audience perceive as risk, and that is not currently covered in your risk repository, right? And that is something where public perception can have an influence, because if you see there are some risks, there are perceptions, there are legitimacy questions, where it actually is something that the public doesn't want or want to have differently, then it can feed back into the anticipatory regulation. And then this is something, and I can say from the EU, the EU has public consultation on the UAI Act, right? So again, this is heavily dominated by companies, but there is a feedback mechanism to feed back to political entities. And I think that is something where action can be taken and where public perception, social science studies can have an impact. Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
Thank you, Kimon,
Thank you so
for
much.
this lovely presentation. Yeah, we continue our seminar series. This has been more seminars that we've had, I think, in any year, and they seem to be accelerating. We will have, I think, the next one, probably 13th of August, where we'll have Apatus, which is the Swedish LLM open group that's been building their LLMs in terms of that space. So maybe now the questions about evaluations come in a bit more, and then this scenario kind of planning using them as maybe outside these big major LLMs as well, and would be very interesting. For the people who are online, thanks for joining us. And the recordings will be available later as normal. Within a day or two, the recording is available, and then we'll send that out. And then for the people who are here, please, yes, there's some snacks, some coffee. Please do indulge. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.